Welcome to Podfics Galore. I'm your horrible online reader, Goldscythe. I read out loud fanfictions for you busy bees, free of charge and no strings attached. Today I will be reading the Silmarillion / Lord of the Rings fic by Bloodwing Blackbird from Archive of Our Own called And Now Each Night I Count the Stars. I hope you can at least try to enjoy my voice, and I will try my best for you with the equipment available to me. Note, this fic is rated explicit. On with the show. And now each night I count the stars. Chapter 1. To the many travelers who passed through the village of Bree, Barliman Butterbur enjoyed a reputation for blustery hospitality, for a certain mercenary business sense, for some very fine ale, but not for wisdom. While it was true that Barliman Butterbur was not as foolish as he seemed, it was also true that he was largely ignorant of matters beyond the daily doings of the Breeland, and, indeed, that was how he liked things. With his daily obligations of brewing and baking, or overseeing such activities as was far more often the case, he found that the proprietorship of the prancing pony was sufficiently taxing so as to justify his near-complete lack of attention to other, possibly greater, matters. So it was that when a ragged harper arrived, Barliman's foremost consideration was almost purely pragmatic. He had looked the fellow over, made a few calculations, and concluded that, like as not, his songs would draw enough of a crowd to sufficiently compensate Barliman for the expense of his board. If someone had suggested that something as soft-headed as compassion might have stirred his spirits, he would have suggested that they had already had as much ale as was good for them, and then winked and called for enough at the top of their mug. As always, when the weather was poor, there was a great mass of folk, all eager to be off the road and as near as fire as they could manage. Those desirable seats closest to the hearth had been claimed by a few sleepy locals already deep in their mugs. There were a few foreigners, large rough-looking men carrying on a raucous conversation at one of the tables, a group of little folk in from the countryside, a small party of dwarves. Off in a corner, ever watchful, sat Strider and one of his rangers, the big quiet one. They puffed at their pipes, tracking the men's argument with evident interest, saying little, but giving each other the occasional significant look. Barliman had never trusted the rangers. Strider and his friends had begun to appear a few years before, and had passed in and out of Bree fairly regularly since then, always just as wild-looking as may be. Strangers were a familiar enough sight in Bree, near a great crossroads as they were. There was something about these men that unsettled him. Something in the way they watched but kept silent. Somehow haughty for all their roughness. It rubbed Barliman wrong. Like they thought they were somehow too good for the village. Besides, he didn't trust a man, big or little, who didn't talk when he was in his cups. He thought to himself that those rangers must be an untrusty sort of folk, or they would not trouble themselves to keep so secret. Despite the innkeeper's personal distaste, they paid for the ale all the same as any other folk, and not only did they not cause trouble, but trouble seemed to mistrust them as much as Barliman did, for it kept far away when the rangers were about. While this didn't precisely endear them to the Bree folk, it did earn them an uneasy sort of respect. Barliman had been watching them from the corner of his eye, half hoping to catch Strider at some crime worse than propping his muddy boots on the pony's furniture, when he heard the ruckus at the door. Their harper had blown in like a big crow, threadbare and bedraggled on a great gust of rain, which had the folk in the common room shivering and cursing at him to "Close the blasted door, you porridge head!" The fellow paused, door still open behind him, banging back and forth in the wind like he wanted to make a point, staring down the crowd until someone muttered, "It's cold, that's all I meant," in a nervous sort of voice. The stranger took his own time pulling the door to. He himself was so swathed in black scarves and hood that Barliman couldn't see anything of his face but the keen shine of eyes, black as holes in the night, darting watchful about the room. Barliman's first thought was of trouble. He was used to rough sorts, and he couldn't afford to be too squeamish about his customers. That said, there was something just a hair uncanny about this fellow, and Barliman watched him close as he could through the crowd. He glanced back at the Rangers to see them watching too, their eyes narrowed. Barliman wasn't certain whether that was comfort or no. It was a dramatic entrance, to be sure, and it made a bit more sense when the fellow set down his pack and started to gently unwrap one of his burdens. A harp, as it turned out, a beautiful thing, carved all over with plants and stars, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to keep it from the damp. One of the foreigners lost no time in calling for a song. The harper flinched a bit from the shouts, but made his way through the crowd to a space near the hearth. The local hobbit shoving over to make more room. He moved strangely, with a shuffling hitch in his step, and Barliman suddenly wasn't sure whether he was a very old man or a very young one. As he passed Barliman, he noticed that he was very tall, but so stooped that Barliman hadn't noticed until he was close. The chill of the night clung to his damp cloak, and Barliman had to shiver a bit, maybe in sympathy, maybe with something more, for he found himself caught for a second in the flash of those eyes, which he had thought were dark, but now could not say. When the harper spoke, his voice was no more than a gruff whisper. Even so, the room went quite silent to the sound, but all he said was, "I'll not sing." With that, he settled into his place, making a great show of arranging himself just so, as if his rags were courtly robes. He didn't take off any of his scarves, or even his gloves, but they had the fingertips cut off, so Barliman guessed they weren't too much of a hindrance. Still, maybe he'd have felt a little easier if he had been able to see the fellow's face. The harper set the instrument to his knee and tuned it, striking clear notes with long fingers that danced over the strings, taking his time as if there was not a restless crowd waiting for a song. When he was finally satisfied, he spoke, his voice harsh as a crow's after the shimmering notes of the harp. "I wrote this tune for my brothers. It puts me in mind of better days." Well, if it did, Barliman would have paid good money to have seen such days, for in those notes he seemed to see a time of true peace, to sleep in darkness unmarred by a whisper of fear, and to dance in a light of such purity and joy that his heart cried out at its loss. The harper struck chords and pulled melodies from the instrument, easy as breathing. They seemed to form shapes in his hands, and Barliman thought that if he listened long enough, he'd find that they could be grasped and unraveled, each into its own tale. As the notes faded into the silence, Barley stirred himself and looked about at his crowd, thinking what a lot of fools they all looked. Grown men crying over the dying notes of a ragged minstrel's song. Even the rangers were watching with rapt attention and light in their eyes. "I'm told the beer here is excellent," remarked the harper, as if he had not just woven some sort of elder magic in Barliman's common room. Barliman bestirred himself with difficulty. I'm told the same, but I suspect as those say it are just wanting a free pint." He waved at Nob, who blew his nose into his sleeve and bustled off for a mug. The crowd laughed feebly at that, and began again to converse in subdued tones. But there were many who would be awoken that night from a dream they could neither explain nor quite recall. A dream of light, of trees, of a many-starred sky. The crowd kept the harper playing late into the night. The storm had passed, and the moon rode high over the tattered wisps of clouds when he was at last able to leave the common room for the chamber the landlord had promised him. The harper had found the guests of the Prancing Pony to be a hospitable bunch, and, wise or not, he had accepted every drink that he had been offered, even when Butterbur brought out a fine bottle of sherry that he had been saving for an unspecified special occasion. He made sure his steps faltered a bit in the hall, but when he found two men awaiting him in his chamber, he was not much taken by surprise. One of them found himself against the wall with the harper's knife at his throat before either of them had the chance to speak. Maybe the inn's drink had fogged his mind, maybe it was simple weariness, but he should have known them immediately. Two men, clad for the road, who had kept quiet and aloof in the corner of the room. If he had, he would not have reacted so, for he had half expected just such a visit. It was too late for whatnots, though. So he had begun, and so he must go on, though maybe it would make things harder later. The man who was not being menaced, a big, slope-shouldered fellow with ruddy hair, a face that seemed like it should smile easier, and a nose that had been broken several times, lifted his hand slowly. "There's no need for that." "That is a judgment which I shall make for myself," the harper said. "What do you want from me?" The man flicked his eyes to his companion and licked his lips nervously, but did not answer. "Is this one the leader, then? Will he answer my questions?" He turned his attention back to the man he held and pressed the knife to the skin below his jaw where he could see the pulse jumping. "Well, answer me, man." With another glance between them, the man nodded, as well as he could. "Very well." He released the fellow and sheathed his knife. "Go on, then." "I only wondered where you learned your songs." He had drawn himself up as tall as he could, and he laid his hand on the hilt of his sword. It was not the first time the harper had seen that sword, though the last time he had seen it, it had still been whole, and the harper had been hidden among a great host. The man who bore it now was dark-haired, grey-eyed, and very like his forefathers. "Do you mean to menace me with a broken sword? Or did you not think that I would recognize it, child of Isildur? What is your name, Dunadan?" "Do you know me, then?" "If I knew you, would I ask your name?" "Which one do you want?" muttered the other man, relaxing his stance but slightly. "In these parts, they call me Strider." "My name is Aragorn, son of Arathorn." This one trusted too easily, the harper thought. The second man sighed, as if he agreed. Aragorn lifted an eyebrow at him. "This is my kinsman, Halbarad." "Who finds one name more than sufficient, I presume," said the harper. Halbarad inclined his head with a little huff, but did not relent in his watchfulness. This, then, was the one he would need to win over if he wanted their trust. He was a bit surprised to find that this was something that he actually wanted to do. "You play the songs of the West," said Halbarad. "Songs that haven't been heard in this part of Middle-earth for many a year." "You know who we are. Is it so strange that we wish to meet another elf friend?" The harper laughed sharply at this, startling himself. "You have gone about us strangely, then, son of Arathorn. Even so, you give me too much credit. Few would call me so." He stood up straight and pushed back his hood. Halbarad's eyes went wide, and he looked away from the harper, unsettled. Aragorn merely nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. The harper had questions of his own, though. "Tell me what the Númenóreans seek in the north. We keep watch on the land of the halflings. If I may be so bold, what is one of the kin of Finwë seeking here?" This Aragorn must have had interesting friends to aim his guess so neatly at the mark. The harper waved the question away like a fly on his meal. "I'm only a simple traveller, good sir." Halbarad had said nothing, merely watching. At that he broke his silence. "You must think we are fools." The harper turned on him. "What would you have me say? Evil things are stirring in this land, and you see it as well as I. Not all of us are content to hide away and let the second-born steal our chance for vengeance," he returned. "As for my name, I think I'd like to see how far you're willing to trust me without it. It's always useful to know when one is in the company of fools," he said at Halbarad's expression. "And would he tell you nothing more of his aims, nor of his people?" Elladan inquired as Halbarad stoked the fire. They were camped at the Dead Men's Dyke. Few came to the grass-grown ruins, but the rangers oft used it as a meeting place. They had started a fire in the remains of a round watchtower and sat here and there upon the tumbled stones. Halbarad pulled a stick from the fire and used the flame to kindle his pipe before brushing off a stone and taking his own seat. Surely there are no longer elves who serve the enemy. It is hard to say, said Elrohir. There were never many who did so knowingly and freely, but not all of his thralls are orcs, and there have been a great number who have done his work unknowingly. Lies and whispers may sometimes cut more deeply than swords. He said nothing of his people, though he is certainly of the Noldor. He had the eyes of those born in the West. He spoke of vengeance, but there are plenty with a grievance against the enemy, said Aragorn. Don't forget, he also called us second-born, added Halbarad. I didn't particularly appreciate that. Aragorn nodded and pulled a stray hair from his eyes and frowned at it. I also find it worrisome that he would not give us his name. Is that so, Strider? Halbarad asked with a chuckle. You gave up yours easily enough, though. What were you thinking? Aragorn ignored this and looked to the twins across the fire. There are many reasons one might wish to hide a name. There are yet more reasons to be careful of those who choose to do so, myself included. Illidan said, I cannot say whether he is worthy of your trust. Only remember that treachery is ever our enemy's greatest weapon. Nevertheless, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or so it is said. He glanced behind the rangers, and they followed his gaze to the dark figure that had appeared without a sound of approach at the edge of the circle of firelight. Any hint of the limp that he had affected in Bree was long gone. Halbarad leapt to his feet, arrowed the string. The harper did not move. Well spoken, sir, he said to Illidan. May I? Welcome, friend. Sit with us, Illidan replied. The harper moved into the light and took a seat on a stone at the edge of their circle, laying his staff across his knees. Firelight flickered across his swathed form. He pushed back his hood and stretched his gloved hands towards the fire. Halbarad watched the twins. He had long suspected them of having some way of knowing what the other thought, but he could see no sign of whatever conversation they might have been holding behind their calm faces. The sons of Elrond are as courteous as their father, he whispered, the eyes glinting back and forth between the twins. You know who we are? Asked Illidan. The shadows shifted as the harper moved his pack from his shoulder, the harp whispering softly within its wrappings. Halbarad understood why he had trouble to hide his voice. It shimmered in his ears, chiming like water over stone. You are very like your father, but you already know that. You speak as if one who knows our father, said Elrohir. I do, said the harper. Or I did. Long time ago. I imagine he has changed. The harp made a soft chiming sound. Shh, breathed the harper. Elrohir sucked in his breath with a hiss. Who are you? What name do you wish to hear? The harper asked, his silver voice mild. This one, he gestured at Halbarad, will think I have too many. Ganafinue, Makalaure, his smile twisted a little. Fenariel, or is Maglor, son of Feanor, the simplest? That is not possible, said Elrohir, his voice flat. Ah, how interesting, the harper replied, flashing a mocking smile. I have been mistaken about things before, but I must have gotten old indeed if I have forgotten my own name. You should not be so quick to mock us, said Elrohir. If you are who you claim to be, your life is forfeit for your crimes against our people. And who will deliver this sentence? Things have changed indeed if Elrond has become so bloodthirsty. Elrohir pushed to his feet and moved towards the harper. Peace, brother, said Illidan. He is right. None of this is our judgment to make. He stood and went to stand in front of Maglor. You must come with us to our father's house. I will not go, said Maglor. Elrohir drew his sword. You must. Maglor smiled, a raw, mocking thing. You know who I am. What do you think will happen if you attempt to bring me by force? I have no doubt that you could kill us all if you wished, said Eladon. But you are a fool if you think our father has never spoken of you. I do not believe that you would kill us. I do not pretend to understand what lies between you and our father, said Elrohir, but I have heard many stories of the sons of Fëanor, and while many things are said about you, I had not heard that you were cowards. Are you so afraid to face the one who was one as a son to you? Is that how he tells it? Said Maklor. I think you have not yet heard all the stories, then. Maklor sat still and silent for a long moment. Very well. Halbarad glanced at Aragorn, finally relaxing the tension of the bowstring. Really? Just like that? All that bluster only to agree after all? Maklor gave him a glance and lifted his nose haughtily, but beneath it there was, just maybe, a ghost of a smile. It is not such a bad proposition. Watch out, Halbarad, said Aragorn. He'll claim it was his own idea before we get to Weathertop. End of chapter 1. Stay tuned.